The first thing Ethan Vo noticed about Berlin was the cold. The kind of cold that didn't simply touch your skin but reached straight through it, curling around your bones like invisible fingers. The snow that fell outside Tegel Airport that December morning looked almost artificial to him, like white confetti thrown across a gray sky. For a boy who had grown up under the California sun, surrounded by palm trees and asphalt that shimmered in the heat, it felt like stepping into another world. His breath rose in clouds as he stood by the taxi line, suitcase at his side, scarf too thin for the biting wind, eyes full of something halfway between fear and wonder. He was 23, armed with a scholarship letter from Humboldt University of Berlin and a heart swollen with the kind of hope only youth and desperation can produce. The scholarship had come after years of sleepless nights balancing community college classes, part-time jobs, and the constant tug of guilt from knowing his parents had worked themselves raw to keep him afloat. Now he was here, Berlin, the city of thinkers, engineers, economists, and dreamers. Somewhere inside this cold, foreign place, he believed, lay the version of himself he'd always been chasing. The taxi driver greeted him in German that sounded fast and sharp. Ethan responded in halting phrases from the back seat, clutching his phrasebook like a life raft. The man laughed, not unkindly, and switched to English, asking if Ethan was a student. Yes, Ethan said, smiling, though the word caught in his throat. The driver pointed out landmarks along the way. The Fernsehturm Tower glinting like a needle against the clouds, the remnants of the Berlin Wall painted with defiant colors, the frozen River Spree. Ethan pressed his forehead against the cold glass and whispered to himself, "I'm really here." His dorm room was small. A bed, a desk, a heater that groaned like an old dog, and a window that looked out onto a courtyard where bicycles leaned in rows. But when he set his worn notebook on the desk and pinned his scholarship letter to the wall, the space became sacred. He unpacked slowly. A photo of his parents smiling in front of their San Jose house, a Vietnamese English dictionary, and a small jade Buddha his mother had tucked into his bag without telling him. Classes began 2 days later, and Ethan quickly learned that the pace of academic life in Berlin was brutal. Professors spoke in a clipped, academic German that his beginner's ear struggled to catch. He recorded every lecture, replaying them late into the night with earbuds in, pausing every few seconds to jot down new words. He learned to survive on coffee, rye bread, and the stubborn will that had carried him from a working-class neighborhood halfway across the world. Some days were lonelier than others. His classmates were polite but distant, more comfortable in their groups, switching effortlessly between German and English while he tried to translate both in real time. Still, there were small victories that kept him alive. The first time he gave a short presentation and heard applause, the first time a professor praised his research paper, the first time he managed to order food without switching to English halfway through. Each success felt monumental, a tiny rebellion against the voice in his head that whispered he didn't belong here. Berlin itself became his teacher. He walked everywhere, through the Unter den Linden Boulevard lined with linden trees that smelled faintly sweet in spring, through the Tiergarten where leaves turned gold in autumn, through narrow streets where the air hummed with the languages of a dozen nations. He loved the efficiency of the city, the honesty of its people, the sense that here, competence mattered more than appearance. Back home in San Jose, his parents would call every Sunday night. His mother's voice always carried warmth wrapped in worry. "Are you eating enough, Ethan? You sound thin." His father, quieter, would occasionally ask about his grades, and when Ethan told him about his research on global trade networks, his father would only say, "Good son. Make something of it." Ethan's best friend from high school, Kevin, once joked over text, "You sound like a movie character, man. Studying in Europe, wearing scarves, drinking coffee in old buildings. Who even are you now?" Ethan replied with a laughing emoji, but deep down he didn't feel like a movie character. He felt like a ghost wandering between worlds, too foreign for Berlin, too changed for home. Yet Berlin loved those who fought to understand it. By his second year, Ethan's German had sharpened to fluency. He could argue about economic policy, navigate bureaucracy, even joke with locals at the corner bakery. His professor, Dr. Friedrich, invited him to join a research project on sustainable logistics. a field that merged Ethan's interest in global trade with environmental ethics. The team was small but brilliant. Students from Poland, Turkey, Kenya, and Germany itself, each carrying their own immigrant stories. The project demanded long nights at the university lab, surrounded by charts, data models, and the smell of stale coffee. Ethan often stayed past midnight, crafting slides for their upcoming presentation at a European business conference. He was exhausted, but the fatigue was the kind that came with purpose. When the team finally stood on stage at the conference, their work projected on a vast white screen. Ethan's voice didn't tremble. He presented in German, every syllable precise, every graph defended with confidence. When the audience applauded, he caught Dr. Friedrich's approving nod, small but genuine. And for the first time, Ethan believed he had earned his place in this city. After the presentation, a senior executive from a logistics company approached him. "You have a sharp mind," the man said, switching to English. "You ever consider staying in Germany after graduation?" Ethan's heart leapt. "Yes, sir," he said. "That's the dream." That night, he walked along the River Spree, the reflection of city lights rippling in the dark water. He imagined a future here. A modest apartment, a real career, perhaps even bringing his parents to visit. He wrote to his mother that same night, "Don't worry about me. I'm doing well. One day, I'll bring you both here. You'll see how beautiful Berlin is in winter." She replied the next day with a photo of their backyard lemon tree, captioned simply, "We're proud of you." Life, for a brief shining stretch, seemed perfectly aligned. Ethan became the go-to translator for foreign students. He tutored classmates struggling with English economic terminology. He spent weekends exploring flea markets, collecting old vinyl records, and teaching himself to cook simple German dishes. Berlin had stopped feeling like exile and started feeling like destiny. Then, one night in late October, as the first snow began to dust the sidewalks, Ethan received an email inviting him to a final interview with a major European trade firm. He stared at the screen, heart racing, reading and rereading the words. The opportunity was everything he had dreamed of, a real career path, a visa sponsorship, a chance to stay. He could finally stop surviving and start living. He stayed up all night rehearsing answers, ironing his only suit, preparing a speech about how cross-cultural trade could bridge nations. The morning of the interview, Berlin glowed with frost. He left early, caught the U-Bahn, and felt, for once, entirely ready. But fate doesn't knock softly. It storms in. As he waited on the platform, his phone buzzed with a call from an international number. California. He hesitated. His interview was in 40 minutes. He almost ignored it, but something in his gut urged him to answer. His mother's voice came through, thin and trembling. "Ethan, your father, he's very sick." For a moment, the station noise faded. The world narrowed to her voice and the dull thud of his heart. What happened?" "He collapsed this morning. The doctor says." She stopped, swallowing tears. "You should come home, Con, as soon as you can." Ethan felt the cold seep back in, sharper than ever. The phone shook in his hand. He turned to watch the train approach, its lights cutting through the tunnel like a blade. When the doors opened, he didn't step inside. He bought a one-way ticket home that afternoon. The airline clerk asked, "Return date?" And Ethan said softly, "I don't know." When the plane lifted off that night, Berlin's skyline glittered below him like a circuit board, distant and fragile. He pressed his forehead to the window, eyes stinging, whispering to himself the same words he had said on his first day here. "I'm really here." Only this time he wasn't arriving. He was leaving something unfinished. A dream still warm in his hands, cooling fast. He tried not to think of the projects he would abandon, the friends he would never properly say goodbye to, or the life that might have been. Instead, he thought of his father's rough hands, of the smell of engine oil that had clung to his childhood, of the man who had once carried him on his shoulders through 4th of July crowds. He would go home, he told himself. He would help. He would find work later. But as the airplane cut through clouds somewhere above the Atlantic, Ethan closed his eyes and felt an ache he couldn't name. The ache of someone who didn't yet know that leaving wasn't just a pause in his story. It was the beginning of another. When the plane descended through the clouds, California looked the same, sunlit and sprawling, palm trees flickering against the freeway haze. But something in Ethan knew he wasn't coming home to the same world he'd left. The air was warmer, heavier, tinged with the scent of gasoline and ocean salt, and when he stepped out of the terminal, it struck him that even the light here felt thicker, more golden, as if refusing to let anyone forget where they came from. His mother was waiting outside baggage claim, wrapped in a gray cardigan that looked 2 sizes too big. Her smile faltered when she saw him. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then she opened her arms. "Contre me?" she whispered, and Ethan, who had practiced German grammar and economic theory with steel precision, felt his throat close at the sound of his mother's voice in Vietnamese. They didn't talk much on the drive home. The freeway signs flashed by in blurs of green and white. His mother's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles pale. Every so often she sniffed, wiped her eyes with a tissue and said, "He's been asking for you." Ethan stared out the window, watching the sunlight crawl across the dashboard, and tried to imagine what his father would look like now, thinner, weaker, yet still somehow the same man who used to fix everything from broken engines to busted toys with quiet determination. The house smelled exactly as he remembered: lemongrass, rice, and motor oil. His father's tools were still lined up on the workbench in the garage, each one wiped clean and placed with surgeon-like precision. His father lay in the bedroom, the curtains half drawn, sunlight slipping through the blinds in thin golden stripes across his face. He looked smaller, his skin pale against the sheets, but when he opened his eyes, they were the same, sharp, steady, filled with an unspoken pride.
Con về rồi à? His father murmured.
Ethan knelt beside the bed and took his hand. "Yes, Dad. I'm home. You were doing good things over there?" his father said, voice barely above a whisper. "Don't give it up for too long." Ethan nodded, though the weight in his chest told him he already had. For the next few months, time became elastic, stretching and snapping without rhythm. He learned to move around the house quietly, cooking, cleaning, managing medications, driving his mother to appointments. The smell of hospitals became part of his days. Sterile air, the faint sweetness of disinfectant, the beeping of monitors marking seconds that felt like hours. His father's illness was relentless. Lung cancer, stage 4. The doctors spoke in careful tones, always emphasizing words like manage, comfort, stabilize. Ethan asked questions, demanded specifics, read articles late into the night about treatments and trials, but deep down he already knew. The strength that had carried his father through decades of hard work could not fight what was already inside him. In those quiet nights, Ethan would sit on the back porch and watch the streetlights flicker. He would think about Berlin, the smell of roasted chestnuts near Alexanderplatz, the echo of footsteps on the cobblestones, the icy wind cutting across the River Spree. Felt like another life. Sometimes he'd catch himself forming sentences in German, then stop, ashamed of the uselessness of it now. He had traded spreadsheets and presentations for grocery lists and pharmacy runs. Yet strangely, he didn't regret it. There was something sacred about being here, about holding his father's hand during the long nights when breathing became a battle, about listening to his mother hum old songs from her youth just to fill the silence. When the end came, it was quiet. No dramatic gasps, no last words. Just a soft exhale that never returned. Ethan sat there for a long time after the machines went still, staring at the hand he still held. It was calloused and scarred. The same hand that had built bicycles, fixed engines, cooked breakfast, and rested on his shoulder the day he'd left for Germany. The weeks that followed blurred into endless paperwork, condolences, and awkward silences. The house grew emptier each day, even with people constantly dropping by with casseroles and gentle words. Ethan helped his mother with funeral arrangements, accepted envelopes filled with sympathy money, and smiled through conversations he barely heard. Everyone said the same thing: he was a good man. He worked hard. He loved his family. Ethan wanted to scream that it wasn't enough, That a man that good shouldn't have had to die in a rented house filled with unpaid bills and unfinished dreams. But he said nothing. He just nodded and thanked them for coming. After the funeral, Ethan sat alone in his father's workshop. The air smelled of oil and dust. He turned a wrench over in his hands, the cold metal pressing into his skin. His reflection in the tool's surface looked older, harder. The scholar from Berlin felt like a stranger. When his mother came in quietly and placed a bowl of soup beside him, she said, "Your father was proud of you. Don't let his hard work go to waste." He wanted to tell her that he had tried, that he had built a future only to watch it collapse overnight. But she didn't need to hear that. She needed hope. So he nodded again and said, "I'll find something." Finding something, however, proved harder than he imagined. The world didn't care about degrees printed in another language. Each job interview became an exercise in humiliation. The recruiters smiled politely when they saw Humboldt University on his resume, but their tone shifted once they realized he had no local experience. "You're very impressive," they'd say, "but this position requires you,'s field knowledge." Some even suggested unpaid internships. Others simply never called back. He sent out dozens of applications a week. When the rejections piled up, he began applying for jobs he'd once considered beneath him. Assistant roles, data entry, even warehouse inventory. One afternoon, a recruiter called and said cheerfully, "You're overqualified, Ethan. You'll find something better." He hung up and laughed bitterly. Better didn't seem to exist anymore. The months stretched on. Bills started arriving with red stamps. His mother took a part-time cleaning job at a dental office. Ethan began working shifts at a local grocery store, stocking shelves at night, trying to convince himself it was temporary. But even that job dried up when the store cut hours. Pride gave way to practicality. Rent didn't care about dignity. One morning, while walking past a strip mall, he saw a help-wanted sign taped crookedly to the window of a fast food restaurant, Mukbauger. The smell of fried oil drifted out the door. For a long time he just stood there, staring at the sign, feeling the weight of all the years between who he had been and who he was now. Then he walked in. The manager, a woman in her 30s with tired eyes and a headset clamped over her hair, looked him up and down. "You ever worked food service before?" "No," Ethan admitted. She frowned at his resume. "You have a degree in economics?" "Yes." "From Germany?" He nodded. "Why do you want this job?" He hesitated. The truthful answer, "Because I have no choice," caught in his throat. Instead, he said, "I'm a quick learner." She studied him for a moment longer, then shrugged. "Fine. Minimum wage. Night shifts start next week. Don't be late." The next day, Ethan bought a pair of black slip-resistant shoes and a red polo shirt 2 sizes too big. When he saw himself in the mirror, uniform tucked into his jeans, cap pulled low, he barely recognized the reflection. The man who once spoke confidently to European executives now practiced smiling at customers in the mirror, repeating phrases like, "Would you like fries with that?" until they stopped sounding foreign. His first week was chaos. The kitchen roared with noise, fryers hissing, timers beeping, teenagers shouting orders over one another. The air smelled permanently of grease and ketchup. Ethan learned to move quickly, to keep his head down, to take insults with silence. Customers were impatient, co-workers indifferent. Some nights, when the rush finally ended, he'd stand outside the restaurant, staring up at the stars smeared by city light, and wonder if the version of himself that once existed in Berlin had ever been real. Still, there were moments of strange peace. Cleaning the counters in rhythmic motions reminded him of studying equations, of solving problems no one else noticed. Translating orders for confused customers gave him brief flashes of purpose. Even in the lowest place, his discipline remained quiet, unbroken. His mother asked one night, "How's work, Khan?" "It's fine," he said, stirring his soup. "Just temporary." She smiled, though her eyes betrayed her disbelief. Everything is temporary if you keep walking forward. He wanted to believe her, so he did. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. The rhythm of the restaurant became second nature. The morning deliveries, the lunchtime chaos, the greasy smell that clung to his clothes even after showers. The other workers stopped mocking his quiet politeness and began to rely on it. "Hey, Ethan, can you cover my shift? Hey man, you're fast with the fryer." He said yes to everything. It was easier that way. But sometimes, when a customer's accent reminded him of Europe, or when a song played that he remembered from a Berlin cafe, something in him twisted. He'd close his eyes and see the snowy streets again, hear the echo of his professor's voice, feel the warmth of applause after his presentation. He would open them again to the reality of buzzing fluorescent lights and the smell of burnt oil. One Thursday, as he mopped the floor near the front counter, the manager called out, "Ethan, grab a register. We're short-staffed." He nodded, wiped his hands on a towel, and took his place behind the cash register. The lunch rush hit fast. Lines forming, people impatient, orders mixing. He kept his voice calm, his smile steady. Then, just as the chaos began to peak, a commotion started near the front of the line. A woman in her 60s, clutching a wrinkled map and speaking rapidly in a language no one seemed to understand, looked on the verge of tears. The cashier beside him glanced over helplessly. "I think she's, speaking French? Or something." Ethan froze for half a heartbeat. No, not French. He recognized the melody of the words instantly. German. His chest tightened. It had been years since he'd spoken it aloud. The woman's voice trembled, desperate. The people behind her began muttering. "What's taking so long? Come on, lady." Without thinking, Ethan stepped forward. His voice came out steady, almost instinctive.
Kann ich Ihnen helfen, gnädige Frau?
The restaurant fell silent. The woman's eyes widened in relief.
Oh, Sie sprechen Deutsch? Gott sei Dank.
The old rhythm returned easily, like a song he had forgotten he knew. He guided her through ordering her meal, found her lost wallet beneath the counter, even wrote down the bus route she was looking for. She thanked him profusely, tears bright in her eyes, and pressed a trembling hand over his.
Sie sind ein guter Mensch.
For a moment, the noise, the smell, the fluorescent lights, all of it faded. He wasn't a fast food worker anymore. He was Ethan Vo, scholar, speaker, bridge between worlds. When she left, applause didn't follow, but something even better did. A quiet ripple of respect. The teenage cashier beside him whispered, "Dude, you speak German?" Ethan just smiled. A little. He turned back to his station, wiping the counter, but inside, something long dormant stirred. Not pride exactly, more like recognition. The smallest reminder that his story wasn't over, just paused. And that night, when he came home smelling of fries and detergent, he placed his red uniform neatly over a chair, stared at it for a long time, and whispered to the empty room, "I'm still here." Outside, the street was quiet, the same California sky hanging heavy with stars. Ethan lay in bed, thinking about the old woman's grateful eyes and the way her words had echoed something his professor once told him. The world rewards those who stay curious, even when no one is watching. He drifted to sleep with a strange, fragile warmth blooming in his chest, the faint pulse of possibility. He didn't know it yet, but the encounter had been seen by someone sitting near the window, a man in a gray suit who would change the direction of his life once more. The next day started like any other. The morning sun fell through the greasy glass panels of the Meckburger storefront, painting soft streaks of gold across the floor. Ethan arrived early as usual, apron folded neatly under his arm, earbuds in, listening to a German podcast he could barely follow anymore. It wasn't that he didn't understand the words. It was that he had forgotten the rhythm, the confident way he used to think in another language, dream in it even. Now it sounded like a voice from another life, faint and fading with time. When he clocked in, the manager gave him a distracted nod. "Morning, Ethan. You're at register 2 today. Lunch rush is gonna be bad." He smiled, the polite, practiced smile of someone used to being underestimated. "Got it, ma'am." By 11, the line was already out the door. Teenagers in hoodies, construction workers with sweat-darkened caps, a few office workers scrolling their phones. The fryer hissed like it was alive, and the air shimmered with the constant motion of bodies and noise. Ethan moved quickly but calmly, punching in orders, handing out change, thanking customers who rarely looked at him. Every so often, his mind drifted back to the old woman from the day before, her wrinkled smile, her relief when she heard his words in German. Something about that encounter refused to leave him, like a melody stuck between heartbeats. Around noon, a sudden flash of light caught his eye. Someone near the window had stood up. A tall man in a gray suit, mid-50s maybe, silver hair cut close, sharp features softened only by a pair of kind eyes. He was holding a paper cup, his gaze fixed on Ethan. When their eyes met, the man smiled, a small, deliberate smile that made Ethan's stomach tighten with unease. The man threw away his cup, walked to the counter, and waited until the crowd thinned. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth but carrying a tone of quiet authority. "You're the young man who helped that German lady yesterday, aren't you?" Ethan hesitated, wiping his hands on his apron. "Yes, sir. She was a little lost." "I saw that," the man said, nodding slowly. "You spoke excellent German." Ethan felt heat rise to his cheeks. Compliments weren't common in this place. "Thank you," he said simply. The man extended a hand. "Mark Keller." Ethan hesitated before shaking it, his hand still damp from sanitizing the counter. "Ethan Vo. You studied in Germany, didn't you?" Mark asked. "Humboldt University, if I'm not mistaken." Ethan blinked, startled. "How did you?" Mark chuckled. "I recognized your accent. I lived in Frankfurt for 10 years. You spoke with the clarity of someone educated there. Let me guess. Economics? International economics and trade," Ethan said quietly. Mark's smile deepened. "I knew it." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek silver card case, and flipped it open with a practiced gesture. A crisp white business card emerged, its edges gleaming faintly under the fluorescent light. "Keller International Logistics, Palo Alto. We're expanding into Europe," Mark said. "And I've been searching for someone who understands both sides. The language, the market, the culture. Not many do. You'd be surprised how hard it is to find people who can bridge worlds." Ethan stared at the card. The logo shimmered faintly, embossed in gold. His pulse quickened. "Sir, I think you might be mistaken. Work here." "I can see that," Mark said, his voice gentle but firm. "But I don't judge people by uniforms. I judge them by how they handle themselves when no one's watching." He leaned closer, lowering his tone. "Yesterday you could have ignored that woman. Most people did. But you didn't. You saw a problem and solved it with grace." Ethan didn't know what to say. His mind felt split between disbelief and fear. For months he had built walls around himself, routines that kept the disappointment quiet. And now, here was a stranger knocking on the door of that quiet, offering something that felt dangerously like hope. "I'm not promising anything yet," Mark continued, "but I'd like to talk. Bring your resume to my office tomorrow morning. 10 a.m. He placed the card on the counter, slid it gently toward Ethan, and smiled again. You never know where life hides its second chances. Then he left. The door swung closed behind him, and the restaurant swallowed the silence. Ethan stood frozen for several seconds until the manager's voice cut through the air. "Vo, what are you doing? Get back to work." He nodded, slipping the card into his apron pocket like it was made of glass. For the rest of his shift, he worked on autopilot. Orders came and went, people complained, fryers beeped. But all he could think about was that business card burning against his chest. That night, when he got home, he placed the card on his desk beside his old degree. The contrast was almost poetic. One symbol of what he had lost, the other of what might still be possible. His mother knocked softly on his door.
"Con, ăn cơm chưa?"
"Not yet, Mom," he said. She peeked in, saw the card, and smiled faintly. "New job?" "Maybe," he said. Someone offered to talk. Her eyes brightened. "Then go. Even a small door can lead to a big room." Ethan nodded, though doubt still gnawed at him. People like Mark Keller didn't just walk into fast food restaurants looking for employees. The world didn't hand out miracles that easily. But he also knew he couldn't ignore it. If there was even a small chance, he had to take it. He spent half the night rewriting his resume, trimming it down, polishing the language, debating whether to include his time at McBugger. Eventually, he decided to leave it out. Not out of shame, but because it didn't define him. It was a bridge, not a destination. At dawn, he put on his only suit, navy blue, pressed the night before, and looked in the mirror. His reflection startled him. The man staring back wasn't the student who had arrived in Berlin years ago, full of naive optimism. Nor was he the exhausted worker behind a counter. He was something in between, tempered, cautious, but still standing. The Keller International office was in Palo Alto, a 30-minute drive north. He borrowed his mother's car, windows rolled down, the cool morning air rushing in. As he drove past the tech campuses and manicured streets, he felt like an intruder in someone else's dream. Glass buildings shimmered like sculptures of wealth. He parked across the street from a cafe, took a deep breath, and walked toward the tall steel doors marked Keller International Logistics. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset and a flawless smile, looked up. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" "Yes," Ethan said, his voice steadier than he felt. "With Mr. Keller." She checked her screen, then nodded. "Go right ahead. He's expecting you." The office was everything the restaurant wasn't. Cool, quiet, the air faintly scented with coffee and paper. Ethan felt small walking across the polished floors. When Mark appeared from a glass-walled conference room, he looked exactly as he had the day before. Calm, composed, the kind of man who carried authority like a tailored suit. "Ethan," he said warmly, "I'm glad you came." They sat by the window overlooking the city. Mark skimmed Ethan's resume with raised eyebrows. "Humboldt, huh? That's impressive. Tell me about your thesis." Ethan spoke carefully, explaining his research on sustainable logistics, the way companies could optimize transport routes to cut emissions while maintaining profit margins. As he talked, the words began to flow again, the vocabulary he hadn't used in years resurfacing like old friends. Mark listened intently, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking sharp questions that made Ethan think harder. When Ethan finished, Mark set the papers down. "You've got a good mind. Sharp, methodical. But more than that, you've got perspective, the kind that can't be taught." Ethan hesitated. "Thank you, sir. I wasn't sure anyone would see that again." Mark smiled. "Life has a strange way of reminding us who we are." He leaned back in his chair. "We have an opening junior analyst, European Trade Division. It's entry-level, but the room to grow is huge. The pay won't make you rich, but it'll get you out of that uniform." Ethan blinked. "You're offering me the job?" Mark chuckled. "Consider it a chance. You'll need to prove yourself. But yes, if you want it, it's yours." For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. His throat tightened. All the months of humiliation, the quiet despair, the long nights cleaning tables, it all flooded him at once. He swallowed hard. "I won't waste it." "I don't think you will," Mark said softly. "I can tell you've been through things that most people here haven't. That's not a weakness. That's your edge." When Ethan left the office that afternoon, sunlight spilled over the glass buildings like molten gold. He stopped on the sidewalk, the offer letter in his hand, and exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. He called his mother before even getting to the car. "Mom," he said, voice trembling, "I got the job." Her laughter burst through the phone, bright and shaky.
"Thật hả con?"
"Oh, thank God. Your father would be so proud." He stood there, smiling through tears, watching people hurry past. Businessmen, baristas, cyclists, each absorbed in their own stories. For the first time, he felt like he belonged among them again. That evening, he returned to McBugger one last time to collect his final paycheck. The manager frowned when he told her he was leaving. "You found another job?" "Yes," he said simply. "A good one." "Well," she said, trying not to sound surprised. "Good luck, Ethan. You were one of the good ones." He smiled, untied his apron, and folded it neatly on the counter. The smell of fries, the hum of machines, the laughter of teenagers. All of it faded into the background as he walked out the door. Outside, the air felt different. Not cleaner, not lighter, just alive. He looked up at the darkening sky and whispered to no one in particular, "Thank you." That night, he placed the offer letter beside his father's photo on the shelf. The man in the picture wore his usual half-smile, the kind that never quite reached his eyes but always meant pride. Ethan touched the frame lightly. "I did it, Dad," he said. "I didn't give up." As he lay in bed later, the faint hum of the refrigerator mixing with the distant sound of traffic, Ethan thought about the strange path that had led him here, from Berlin's icy streets to a fast food counter, from grief to gratitude. Life, he realized, wasn't a straight line. It was a circle, always returning you to the lessons you were meant to learn. Humility, kindness, resilience. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deep, peaceful. In his dreams, he stood once again on a Berlin street, snow falling softly, his breath visible in the air. But this time he wasn't cold. The first day at Keller International felt like stepping back into the version of himself that Ethan had quietly buried years ago. The office gleamed with quiet order. Glass walls, soft gray carpets, coffee machines humming low in the background. Everyone moved with purpose, typing briskly or murmuring into headsets. It wasn't Berlin. The air here smelled faintly of polished wood and Californian sun rather than rain-soaked stone, but it carried the same rhythm of ambition, that pulse of minds building invisible empires. Mark Keller greeted him at the door to the conference room. "You made it," he said, clapping him lightly on the shoulder. "I had a feeling you would." Ethan smiled nervously, his tie slightly crooked, a stack of documents under his arm. He was no longer the kid mopping floors, but the memory of that smell, fries and detergent, still followed him, faint and ghost-like. Mark introduced him to the team, a mix of sharp-eyed analysts in crisp shirts and sleek dresses. "Everyone, this is Ethan Vo, our newest analyst. He's joining the European Trade Division." There were polite nods, a few murmured welcomes. A woman named Dana offered him a seat beside her desk and whispered, "Don't worry, we were all terrified our first week." The first few days blurred together. Onboarding packets, passwords, meetings, charts. He spent long hours absorbing company data, relearning the language of logistics, freight routes, carbon metrics, cost optimization, supplier chains. It came back quickly, as though those years of silence had simply been a pause, not an ending. He remembered why he loved it, the elegance of finding order in chaos, of tracing 1,000 moving parts and discovering the single correction that made them align. Yet, every time he caught his reflection in a polished window, something inside him hesitated. The imposter feeling crept in like a quiet whisper. "You don't belong here. You were flipping burgers 6 months ago." During meetings, when colleagues threw around acronyms or referenced European policy updates, Ethan's pulse would quicken. He took meticulous notes, staying late each night to fill in the gaps. He refused to let anyone see him falter. Mark noticed the effort, though he never said anything. Instead, he'd occasionally stop by Ethan's desk and ask, "Settling in?" The answer was always yes, though the truth was more complicated. At home, his mother still packed him lunches, neat boxes of rice and grilled fish. She treated his new job like a miracle she didn't want to disturb. "Your father would smile if he saw you in that suit," she said one morning as she poured his coffee. Ethan smiled back, though something about her words stung. He wanted to believe he had earned this life, not stumbled into it through chance and pity. Weeks turned into months. The rhythm of Keller International began to feel natural. Ethan earned small praises. His reports were detailed, his models precise, his communication crisp. Dana told him, "You work like someone who's trying to make up for lost time." He only nodded. She didn't know how true that was. Sometimes, after hours, he stayed in the office when everyone else had gone home. He'd walk to the window overlooking the city, lights flickering like constellations, and think about how fragile everything still felt. He could almost hear the Friars again, Smell the salt and oil. Feel the quiet humiliation of being invisible. That memory wasn't bitterness anymore. It was fuel. It reminded him what mattered. Not titles, not salary, but the chance to be useful again. One night, while he was finalizing a cost analysis report, Mark walked by and stopped. "Still here?" "Just finishing this projection for the Zurich account," Ethan said without looking up. Mark leaned against the doorway. "You know, most people your age run out the door at 5. What drives you, Ethan?" He paused, pen hovering above the page. "When you lose everything you thought you were," he said slowly, "you work hard not to waste what's left." Mark studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Good answer. Under Mark's mentorship, Ethan's role grew. He started attending client meetings, presenting his own findings. His German fluency became an unexpected asset. One afternoon, a call came in from Munich. A logistics partner confused about documentation. None of the other analysts could follow the conversation, but Ethan switched languages effortlessly, resolving the issue in minutes. When he hung up, the room fell silent for a beat before someone said, "Holy hell, you're fluent." He smiled modestly. Used to be better. Word spread quickly. Within weeks, he was leading correspondence with several European clients. He found himself back in his element, navigating between cultures, solving problems that felt real. Every email, every call, every negotiation built a bridge between the man he was and the man he wanted to be. But success didn't silence the ghosts. Late one evening, as he left the building, he saw a Mechbauger across the street, neon sign flickering in the dark. Through the window, a young worker was wiping a counter, face tired, eyes glazed. The sight hit him harder than expected. He stood there for a long minute watching, until a gust of wind carried the faint, greasy scent toward him. He turned away quickly, heart pounding. The next morning, during a team meeting, Dana mentioned that Keller International was sponsoring a charity program to support immigrant education. "We're collecting volunteers to help teach ESL and job skills on weekends," she said. "They need mentors who can connect with people from tough backgrounds." Ethan's hand went up before he could think. "I'll do it." Every Saturday for the next few months, he drove to a community center downtown. The building was old, the paint cracked, but the room inside was alive, full of people from every corner of the world. Refugees, single parents, delivery drivers. Ethan stood at the whiteboard teaching phrases like interview questions, customer service greetings, resume building. Sometimes he caught himself smiling when someone finally understood a sentence or nailed a pronunciation. He recognized their hunger, that quiet, desperate desire to belong. One evening, after class, an older man lingered behind. His English was broken, his clothes worn. "Teacher," he said, "you talk like someone who remember. What'd it feel like to start again?" Ethan froze, then nodded. "Yeah," he said softly, "I do." That night, driving home, he realized something had shifted. He no longer feared the memory of where he came from. It had become a foundation, not a wound. The fast food counter, the mop, the humiliation, they were proof of endurance. Proof that he could rebuild himself piece by piece. A few weeks later, Keller International announced a major expansion. Mark called Ethan into his office. "We're sending someone to head up a new liaison division in Frankfurt," he said. "You'd oversee partnerships between our U.S. and European clients. You speak the language. You understand both sides. What do you think?" Ethan stared at him, unable to speak. "Frankfurt," he repeated, as if tasting the word. Mark smiled. Consider it coming full circle. The offer was formalized a week later. When Ethan told his mother, she didn't cry this time. She just nodded, eyes shining with quiet pride. "It's time, Con. You've always belonged to more than one place." The night before his flight, Ethan visited his father's grave. The grass was neatly trimmed, the headstone cool beneath his fingers. He placed a small paper crane beside it, one his mother had folded earlier that week. "I'm going back," he said softly, "but I'll carry home with me this time." As dawn broke, he stood in line at the airport once again. suitcase in hand. But the feeling was different now, not of escape but of return. When the plane lifted off, he looked down at California shrinking below, then out toward the horizon where the sun caught the curve of the clouds like fire. Somewhere ahead waited the city that had once broken him and now beckoned him home. He didn't know what awaited him in Frankfurt. Success, failure, something in between. But for the first time he wasn't afraid of either. He had learned that dignity wasn't a gift given by others. It was something reclaimed, rebuilt, and carried quietly like a flame that refused to die. And as the engines roared and the sky opened wide, Ethan smiled. Not because the pain was gone, but because he had finally learned what it meant to live through it. When the plane descended through the clouds and the skyline of Frankfurt appeared, sleek, mirrored, glinting under a soft winter sun, Ethan felt the strangest sense of déjà vu. The sharp, sterile air, the familiar rhythm of announcements in German and English, even the way people hurried past with coats wrapped tightly around them. It all struck him like a half-remembered song. He hadn't been here since that day he left Berlin, since that silent promise to his dying father that he would find a way to make it all mean something again. And now, here he was, returning not as a student, but as a representative of Keller International, the company whose card had once felt too heavy for his hand. Outside the terminal, the air was cold enough to sting. He pulled his scarf higher and looked around, his breath misting in the morning light. The city felt different from Berlin, less historical, more modern, all glass and business and forward motion. Frankfurt wasn't meant for nostalgia. It was built for efficiency, for people who had somewhere important to be. And yet, as he stood there waiting for his taxi, Ethan couldn't help but feel the faint pull of the past tugging at him, whispering that life had brought him full circle. The company's European branch office was in the heart of the financial district, a tall, minimalist building overlooking the River Main. Inside, everything gleamed, brushed metal, tinted glass, the low hum of disciplined productivity. His new team was polite, curious, and clearly aware that he had come from the American headquarters. They treated him with a cautious kind of respect, the kind reserved for people who were both outsiders and possible allies. The first few weeks were a blur of introductions, long meetings, and quiet observation. Ethan found himself relearning habits, the German punctuality, the precise etiquette, the measured pauses in conversation that carried meaning even in silence. His German returned quickly, flowing more easily than it had in years. Some of the older staff teased him gently for his slight Californian accent. He laughed with them, feeling something inside unclench. He rented a small apartment near the river, modest, bright, filled with second-hand furniture. The first night, as he unpacked, he set two things on the table: his father's photo and the jade Buddha his mother had given him when he first went abroad. The two objects faced each other like bookends of a life that had bent but never broken. Work consumed him, but in a way that felt nourishing. His task was to bridge communication between American partners and European logistics firms, to translate not just language but intent, culture, and tempo. It was delicate work, requiring empathy more than authority, and that suited him perfectly. He approached every call and negotiation with patience, remembering the frustration of the lost German tourist in McBugger. In every confused client or overworked supplier, he saw a reflection of her, and of himself years ago, lost in translation. It wasn't long before his steady calm began to attract notice. Clients started asking for him specifically. His reports were circulated beyond his department, and one morning Mark Keller himself called from Palo Alto to check in. "You're making a name for yourself, Ethan," he said. "I hear Frankfurt's running smoother than ever." Ethan chuckled softly. "I just try to listen, sir." "That's exactly why it works," Mark replied. But beneath the growing success, a quiet restlessness remained. Some nights, after long days of meetings and spreadsheets, Ethan would walk along the river, hands buried in his coat pockets, watching the reflections of the city lights ripple across the dark water. He would think of Berlin, of the lecture halls, of Dr. Friedrich, of the student who once believed the world would bend to pure ambition. He wondered where that version of himself had gone, and whether he'd ever truly return. One evening, as he sat at a cafe sipping strong black coffee, he overheard two young men at the next table speaking in hurried, frustrated tones. Their accents were Vietnamese, his mother's accent, his own childhood language softened by years abroad. "I told you they won't hire us," one said. "We don't have papers for long-term work. Even for cleaning jobs, they ask for local references." Ethan looked up, listening quietly. The other side. "I came here for school, you know. Thought I could finish my degree. But tuition's impossible. Now I'm doing deliveries. It's all I can get." Their conversation trailed off into tired laughter, but something in Ethan's chest twisted. He saw himself in them, not just the struggle, but the quiet dignity of people trying to make their lives mean something, even when the world barely noticed. When they left, he slipped a business card under their abandoned cup, his card with his email scribbled on the back. No message, just a quiet invitation. He didn't know what he would do yet, only that he wanted to help. A week later, one of them wrote to him, polite, hesitant, thanking him for listening. His name was Min, a former engineering student now working nights as a janitor. Ethan invited him for coffee. Min arrived early, nervous and apologetic, his hands calloused from long hours of work. He spoke of home, of dreams deferred by paperwork and poverty, and Ethan listened, nodding. "Maybe I can help," Ethan said finally. "Not with everything, but maybe with something small. An introduction."
À résumer review.
You never know what might open a door. Min looked at him as though he'd offered a miracle. "Why would you do that for me?" Ethan smiled. "Because someone once did it for me." That small act became the beginning of something unexpected. Over the next few months, Ethan found himself quietly mentoring several young immigrants. Some Vietnamese, some Syrian, some Eastern European, people he met through community groups, churches, or by chance. He reviewed resumes, gave mock interviews, explained workplace etiquette. He didn't tell them about McBugger. He didn't need to. His empathy carried the truth of it. At work, his responsibilities expanded. Keller International launched new sustainability projects, and Ethan was asked to lead one of them. A partnership between American and German logistics networks to reduce carbon emissions through optimized routes. It was the same concept he had once proposed as a student years ago, now given real-world weight. The irony made him smile. Life, he realized, didn't erase old dreams. It simply waited for you to be ready for them. During one high-level meeting, a senior executive from Berlin recognized his name. "You're from Humboldt, aren't you? I remember your conference presentation on supply chain optimization. Brilliant work." Ethan was stunned. He hadn't thought anyone would remember. The man chuckled. "Looks like the student became the practitioner. Good to see your ideas finally have wings." That night, as he walked home through falling snow, the city lights blurred into halos. He stopped on a bridge overlooking the river. The air smelled of rain and winter, and for a brief, perfect moment, he felt his life align. The past, the struggle, the strange grace of survival. He thought of his father again, of his mother's quiet faith, of the people who had seen him not for his failures but for his worth. And then he thought of the young men at the cafe, still fighting their own uphill battles. Maybe, he realized, redemption wasn't about success at all. Maybe it was about remembering to reach back once you'd climbed a little higher. By spring, Ethan's name was on Keller International's short list for promotion. His project had outperformed expectations, and Mark Keller planned to visit Frankfurt in person for the review. The announcement caused a quiet buzz around the office. Dana, now a close friend and long-distance confidant, called to congratulate him. "You deserve this, Ethan. After everything." He laughed softly. "Deserve is a big word, Dana. I just got lucky." "No," she said. "You didn't. You kept walking forward." The night before the review, Ethan stayed late, fine-tuning his final report. When he finally shut off the lights, he caught his reflection in the glass. The same eyes, the same face, but steadier, fuller somehow. He smiled at the man looking back. "We made it," he whispered. But fate, as always, had a sense of irony. The next morning, As he arrived at the office, he found chaos. One of the major European clients had abruptly withdrawn from a joint venture, citing miscommunication and cultural friction. The team was in panic. Mark Keller had already landed in Frankfurt and was demanding an emergency meeting. Ethan felt the old adrenaline surge. Not fear exactly, but the heavy awareness that everything he had built could crumble again in an instant. He gathered his notes, steadied his breath, and walked into the boardroom. The air was thick with tension. Mark sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. "Ethan," he said, "they're pulling out. We need a solution today." Ethan looked around the room, saw the fear in his colleagues' faces, and felt something inside him settle. This was what he had trained for. This was why he had come back. He switched languages seamlessly, drafting an emergency proposal in both English and German, suggesting a neutral third-party mediator and a revised delivery schedule that accounted for the client's regulatory concerns. The words flowed out of him like instinct, calm, precise, persuasive. By evening, the client had agreed to reconsider. The partnership was salvaged. The office erupted in quiet relief. Mark walked over, placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder and said, "That was exceptional work." Ethan smiled faintly. "Just doing my job." "No," Mark said. "You did more than your job. You reminded everyone here that patience and empathy aren't just soft skills. They're survival skills. Don't ever lose that." That night, Ethan stood again by the river, the city lights dancing on the water. The cold bit at his fingers, but he didn't mind. He thought about how everything had come full circle. Not in grand gestures, but in quiet, steady persistence. He whispered, almost to himself, "Die Welt ist klein.
Bleiben Sie freundlich.
The world is small. Stay kind." And somewhere between the wind and the current, it almost felt like the city whispered back. Summer in Germany arrived gently, as though the city had decided to forgive the long months of gray. Trees along the river bent in soft green arcs, the air smelled faintly of rain and jasmine, and the sunlight lingered longer each evening, reluctant to let go. From his office window on the 12th floor, Ethan often paused to watch the world below. People cycling along the embankment, couples walking dogs, children chasing pigeons in the fading gold of twilight. The life of the city no longer felt foreign to him. It felt earned. Yet deep inside, he sensed a quiet stirring, the awareness that every circle, no matter how wide, must eventually close. It had been nearly a year since he'd taken over the European Liaison Division. The once quiet analyst had become a leader, not loud or commanding, but deliberate, the kind of presence that steadied the room rather than filled it. His team trusted him and his projects thrived. Keller International's European network was stronger than ever, and word from headquarters hinted that another promotion was on the horizon. But whenever people congratulated him, Ethan only smiled politely and said thank you. He no longer chased titles. He had already learned that what made life meaningful was not the ladder, but the climb, the people who reached for you when you were slipping, and the ones you pulled up when it was your turn to stand tall. That afternoon, Mark Keller called him into a conference meeting. The older man had aged a little, more lines around the eyes, more silver in the hair, but the same quiet authority lingered in his gestures. "Frankfurt's been your masterpiece," he said with a smile. "You've built something lasting here, Ethan. But I know you, and I know when someone's ready for the next chapter." He leaned forward, clasping his hands. "We're opening a new European training initiative, leadership development for young professionals from underrepresented backgrounds. It'll be based in Berlin. I want you to run it."
Berlin.
The name alone felt like a heartbeat returning after years of silence. Ethan's chest tightened. The city of his beginnings. The city he had fled in grief, then chased in memory. He took a breath, trying to steady his voice. "Berlin," he said softly. "That's unexpected." Mark smiled. "Life likes symmetry." He left the office with the offer letter still warm in his hand, walked down to the river, and sat on a bench where the summer breeze carried the sound of street musicians playing a soft waltz. He watched the water drift by and thought about all the turns that had led him here, the years of silence, the shame of failure, the small kindness that had changed everything. He realized something simple but profound. No one escapes the shape of their own story. They just learn to read it differently. He moved to Berlin a month later. The train ride north was quiet and contemplative. The landscape sliding past in flashes of green fields, red rooftops, and long stretches of forest that smelled of pine and memory. When the city finally appeared, it was both familiar and foreign. The skyline had changed. Cranes and glass towers had risen where old buildings once stood. Yet some corners looked untouched, stubbornly holding on to the ghosts of the past. His new office was near Alexanderplatz, just a few blocks from where he had once lived as a student. The first morning, he arrived early, the streets still damp from rain. The cafe he used to frequent was still there, though the sign was new, and when he walked in, the smell of coffee and bread hit him with almost painful nostalgia. He ordered in German without thinking, and when the barista smiled and said, "You sound local," he smiled back. But his voice caught slightly when he replied, "Maybe I finally am." The training program began small. 10 students from across Europe, all first-generation scholars or immigrants, uncertain but ambitious. On the first day, they sat in a semicircle around him, notebooks open, eyes filled with the same mixture of fear and hope he had once carried into his own first lecture years ago. He introduced himself not as Mr. Vo from Keller International, but simply as Ethan. "I'm not here to teach you how to be perfect," he told them. "I'm here to show you that being lost doesn't mean you've failed. It just means you're on your way." Over the following weeks, he saw their confidence grow. Some struggled with language barriers, some battled imposter syndrome, and some were simply trying to survive in a system that often forgot people like them existed. Ethan saw himself in every face. He stayed late after sessions, listening to their stories. A Syrian student who wanted to rebuild her father's business. A Polish immigrant who dreamed of engineering eco-friendly transport systems. A young Vietnamese man who confessed that his family thought working in logistics was a failure compared to becoming a doctor. Ethan laughed softly at that one and said, "Trust me, you can move the world with numbers, too." He never mentioned the fast food restaurant, the red apron, or the smell of grease that once clung to his hands. But sometimes, when he caught a certain look in their eyes, that flicker of shame mixed with longing, he would tell them, "There's no such thing as wasted time if it teaches you how to see others more clearly." One afternoon, as he packed up after class, he noticed a familiar face waiting by the doorway. Dr. Friedrich, his old professor from Humboldt University. The man's hair had gone gray, but his posture was still upright, his presence quietly formidable. "Herr Vo," he said warmly. "It's been a long time." Ethan froze for a heartbeat, then smiled, shaking his hand. "Too long, sir." "I've followed your work," Friedrich said. "Keller International's sustainability models. They're built on the same principles you once presented as a student. I always wondered if you'd return." "I almost didn't," Ethan admitted. "But I think I needed to lose myself first to understand what I'd been chasing." The professor nodded slowly. "And did you find it?" Ethan looked around the room. The empty chairs, the fading sunlight slanting through the windows, the echo of laughter from the hallway. "I think so," he said. "Not in success, in connection." Friedrich smiled. "Then you've learned the most important lesson academia can't teach." They parted with a promise to meet again, and that evening, Ethan walked through the streets of Berlin until he reached the River Spree. The water reflected the city lights like shattered glass. Across the bridge, a street musician played a violin softly, and people paused to listen. Ethan leaned on the railing, the cool metal against his palms grounding him in the present. He closed his eyes and let the music carry him back, to the boy stepping off a plane years ago, filled with wild ambition, to the man scrubbing floors silent and ashamed, to the worker who spoke one kind sentence to a stranger and unknowingly changed the course of his life. He remembered the woman's words, "Die Welt ist klein.
Bleiben Sie freundlich.
The world is small. Stay kind." It struck him that kindness was the only real constant, the only currency that didn't lose value no matter where you spent it. It had carried him across continents, through grief, through failure, through rediscovery. It had connected him to strangers who became teachers, mentors, and friends. And now it was what he passed on, not through lectures or policies but through presence. That realization came full circle a few weeks later when Keller International invited Ethan to give a keynote speech at a global summit on sustainable business leadership. The conference was held in Frankfurt, the same city where he had first found his footing again. He stood backstage, adjusting his microphone, heart steady but full. When his name was announced, the applause sounded distant, almost unreal. He stepped into the light, looked out over the sea of faces. Executives, students, workers, dreamers, and for a moment, saw them all blur together into one collective story. He began not with a statistic or a business model, but with a memory. Years ago, he said, I worked in a fast food restaurant. One afternoon, an elderly woman came in speaking a language no one else understood. People laughed, dismissed her, grew impatient. I stepped forward, spoke to her in her language and helped her. I didn't know it then, but that small act, that simple bridge, would bring me here today. The room was utterly silent. He went on, his voice calm and sincere. Our work, whether in business, education, or daily life, is not just about efficiency. It's about empathy. The best systems in the world fail without humanity holding them together. If we remember to listen, to see, to stay kind, then no experience, no struggle, no moment of humility is ever wasted. Everything connects. When he finished, the applause came not as thunder but as a long, sustained warmth, the kind that didn't need volume to have power. As he stepped off the stage, Mark Keller met him at the edge of the curtain, smiling quietly. You've come a long way from that restaurant, Ethan. Ethan laughed softly. Maybe I never left it, he said. Maybe I just learned how to make it bigger. That night, after the conference, he walked once more to the riverbank. The city shimmered in reflection, the water alive with streaks of light. He took out his phone and typed a short message to his mother. All is well, Mom. I'm still walking forward. Her reply came almost instantly. Your father would be proud. I am too. He pocketed the phone, closed his eyes, and let the evening settle around him. Somewhere behind the noise of the city, he could almost hear his father's voice, gentle and steady. Don't give it up for too long. He smiled. I didn't, Dad. I found my way back. The wind lifted, carrying the scent of the river and the faint echoes of laughter from the far side of the bridge. He felt the old ache, the kind that came not from loss, but from gratitude too large to contain. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what came next. He was simply here, present, whole enough. The water moved below, endless and patient. Above it, the city pulsed with light, circles within circles, lives crossing and recrossing in ways none of them could ever fully see. Ethan watched it all, his heart steady, his eyes bright with quiet peace. He whispered again, softly, like a prayer to the wind, Die Welt ist klein.
Bleiben Sie freundlich.
And somewhere between the rippling light and the sound of the river, the words no longer belonged to him alone. They belonged to everyone who had ever fallen, risen, and chosen to keep walking, one act of kindness at a time.